Enroll your child for the manifested e-learning platform and see their grades grow tremendously. These videos can be downloaded to a laptop for offline viewing or viewed from a smartphone in a course-friendly format.
How are you, learners? Welcome to our today's geography lesson. The topic is the hydrological cycle and the action of rivers. This is our second lesson. During the first lesson, we defined the hydrological cycle. Then we listed the various processes that are found in the hydrological cycle. Learners, welcome to the lesson. The subject is geography. We're continuing with the topic hydrological cycle and the action of rivers. So our main focus is on the hydrological cycle in our today's lesson. Learners, in the first lesson, I defined the hydrological cycle. I say that the hydrological cycle is the endless movement of water from the air to the Earth's surface and then back to the air again. We said it's also referred to as water cycle. Then we stated that the circulation of water is carried out through several processes. In our today's lesson, I want to explain the processes through which water is carried out through from the air to the Earth's surface and then back to the air. So learners, we defined hydrological cycle. We said that hydrological cycle is the movement of water. Hydrological cycle is the movement of water from the air to the Earth's surface, from the air to the Earth's surface and back to the air again. It is also referred to as water cycle. And this circulation of water is carried out through several processes. This circulation of water is carried out through the following processes. This is what we learned in our last lesson. The first process is evaporation. Number 2, cooling. Number 3, condensation. Number 4, precipitation. Number 5, surface runoff. Number 6, learners, infiltration. Number 7, percolation. Then lastly, overland flow. overland flow. This is what we covered in lesson 1. In lesson 2, we're going to explain these processes: evaporation, cooling, condensation, precipitation, surface runoff, infiltration, percolation, and overland flow. And to help us understand these processes, I have drawn a diagram here, learners. This is a diagram showing the hydrological cycle. The hydrological cycle. Down here, you can see we have the sea. Down here we have the lake. Okay, and this is the surface of the earth. The surface of the earth. Learners, this is the surface of the earth, and this here we have plants. So learners, the hydrological cycle begins with the evaporation of water from the sea. All right? Evaporation, learners. What is evaporation? Now, evaporation is the process by which liquid water changes into water vapor. Evaporation is the process through which liquid water changes to water vapor. And this takes place on the open water surface. Open water surfaces like the sea, like the oceans, okay? The lakes, the ponds, the rivers, all right? Now, learners, evaporation takes place on the surfaces. Open, we are talking about open water surfaces, open water surfaces. The sea is on an open water surface. The lakes are on open water surfaces, like this one here. The rivers are on open water surfaces. The seas, the ponds, the swamps. Now, learners, the water is changed into water vapor by the sun's heat. Because these are open water surfaces, learners, the sun directly hits these surfaces, then this liquid water is changed into vapor. Then evaporation takes place. All right? Evaporation takes place after the sun heats the water that is found in seas, in rivers, in lakes, in swamps, and so on. And it rises into the atmosphere. You can see this water vapor rises into the atmosphere. Now, learners, apart from the water that is converted from liquid water to water vapor, there is also the water that is changed into water vapor through the process we are calling transpiration. Some water, learners, some water vapor is also added to the atmosphere from the soil, through the process of transpiration. This is transpiration of plants. Transpiration of plants. Now, when the water vapor that rises from the seas and open water surfaces combines with the water that is released in the atmosphere through transpiration of plants, that combination of the two, we call them evapotranspiration. It's called evapotranspiration. The loss of water through these two processes, this process and this process from the soil. These two processes, the combination of loss of water from liquid to water vapor is known as evapotranspiration. Learners, do you get the point? So again, learners, it's important to remember that 80% of water vapor, 80% of water vapor in the atmosphere, 80% of water vapor in the atmosphere evaporates from the ocean. And the remaining percentage of around 20, okay, evaporates from sources like rivers, lakes, and the soil. And that should be well understood, learners. It should be very easy for you to understand why 80% of the water that is in the atmosphere is from these oceans, because the ocean covers around 70% or 80% of the surface of the earth, and it is an open surface. So most of the water vapor is evaporates from the ocean. So you have seen evaporation, learners. Evaporation from the oceans, from the other, from the lakes, and also evaporation that is through loss of water, through the process of transpiration, loss of water through the soil, giving us the two processes combined. We have the evapotranspiration. Then, learners, is the second process, which is known as cooling. The second process is known as cooling. Learners, I want to take you again to the processes. We are discussing processes. The circulation of water is carried through the following processes. Evaporation. We have explained how that happens. We now want to explain cooling. Cooling, learners. Now, learners, as the water vapor rises into the atmosphere, as the water vapor rises into the atmosphere, it expands and cools because of the reduced atmospheric pressure in the upper layers, of the atmosphere, in the upper layers of the atmosphere. So this is vapor. As it moves in the upper layers of the atmosphere, it cools. That's what we are calling cooling. This is the cooling process. The cooling process. Then after the cooling process, learners, you have the process known as condensation. Condensation. What is condensation? Condensation. Now, learners, condensation is when the cooling of water vapor continues below dew point. This cooling continues below dew point. As it continues to cool below dew point, the vapor turns into tiny water droplets, and these droplets gather together to form what we call clouds, learners. These are clouds. After condensation, then we have the clouds. The droplets join together in large quantities to form clouds. So, learners, when these clouds become too heavy laden with moisture, when these clouds become too heavy laden with moisture, they release it in a process we are calling precipitation. Okay? Precipitation. This process takes water back to the ground. Takes this water back to the ground in form of rain. It can be in form of rain. It can be in form of hail. It can be in form of snow. It comes back to the ground, comes back to the ground. See this water, these arrows show water that is falling back to the ground in form of snow, in form of rain, in form of hail. This rain is falling, learners. All right? All right? The process takes water back to the ground in form of hail, in form of rain, in form of snow. And again, learners, you can see the water is coming back. Then the water hits the ground here through the process we are calling here infiltration. Okay? Infiltration. Then there is water infiltrates the ground. There is some water that runs on the surface of the earth. We are calling it surface runoff. Now, when precipitation reaches, learners, when precipitation reaches the ground in form of rain, some water flows from the surface into the valleys, from the surface into the valleys, into ponds, into lakes, learners, into swamps, and even into the sea here. This water comes back to into the sea. Now, this form of water flow is known as surface runoff. Is known as surface runoff. The water that hits the surface of the earth, it goes back to the valleys, into lakes, into seas, into swamps, and so on. Now, learners, other than the water that runs on the surface of the earth from precipitation, the rain that falls in form of the water that falls down in form of hailstone rains and snow, learners, there is this water that finds its way inside. All right, there is also some water, learners, from precipitation that seeps into the ground, through pores, through cracks, can be cracks between rocks, through joints, okay, that is found between rock particles, learners, this one here. So it can hit, then it seeps into the ground. This water here can hit, then flow. I've explained how that flows. But there is some water, learners, that when it hits the ground, it does not run on the surface, but it is seeped into the ground through joints, through cracks found between rock particles. And you can see here is the water. That is the direction of the water. Learners, now this entry of water into the ground, this water here into the ground is what is referred to as infiltration. Okay, this one here, pop, infiltration. All right, pop, it seeps into the ground. Then there is the other water, pop, and runs on the surface. Now, the water that finds its way into the ground through infiltration, learners, moves downwards and sideways, through the process we are calling gravity, because the force of gravity inside, the water is forced down due to gravity. And it does this by passing through cracks, through joints, through pores that exist between rocks, okay, and also between the rock particles. And some of this water, learners, some of this water is may reappear at some point. Down the slope as spring. Down the rock, which becomes a source of water, learners. The source of water, it can be a source of a river, like the river I mentioned to you where I was born. There is a river, that water that comes from the ground. We call it Izorori, Mzorori. That water from Izorori has never dried up. This water that we are seeing may be because of percolation. Okay, percolation. We say that inside the ground, the water which was infiltrated, which moves down and sideways by gravity. It does this by passing through cracks, joints, pores that exist between rock particles. And that is a process we are calling percolation. That is a percolation process. Then learners, we have the overland flow. Overland flow. This is another process through which water circulates, right, from the air to the earth's surface and back to the air. Overland flow. Overland what? Overland flow. Learners, what is overland flow? Now, learners, the water, both the surface runoff, and the water that flows through the rivers, the water that flows on the surface, and the water that flows in the rivers, make up what we are calling overland flow. The water that flows on the surface and that water that flows on the rivers, that flows in the rivers, the waters on the surface and the waters in the rivers, learners, make what we call overland flow. Okay? So the river water flows back to the ocean. It flows back to the oceans and other drainage basins. It flows back to the ocean, learners, and the seas. And then evaporation takes place once again. It takes place once again. It takes place once again. So you can see at that point, learners, the hydrological circle is complete. This is where we began, learners. We say that water that is in the seas and water that is lost through transpiration is evaporated. Learners, is evaporated after the sun hits on the surface of the sea and the surface of the ground. This water evaporates, and the water that is lost through evaporation and transpiration, we said, is known as evapotranspiration. So it goes again, learners, cooling process, then it condenses into clouds. When these clouds become thicker, all right, they fall down through the process we are calling precipitation. Precipitation, when clouds become too heavy laden with moisture, learners, they are released in a process we are calling precipitation. And water comes back to the earth, all right, back to the earth in form of rain, in form of hail, in form of snow. That water, again, we remember we said, is either infiltrates the ground, okay, infiltration, this water seeps into the ground immediately, or it runs on the surface of the earth. And again, the water that infiltrates, we find it through the process we call percolation in the ground. Because of gravity, that water seeps down. Because of gravity, the water that runs on the surface finds itself in the lakes, finds itself in the rivers, and that water, the overland, we have now the river water, and the water that is on the surface again finds itself in the sea. Then the water again is evaporated. So that is the hydrological cycle, learners. Hydrological cycle. And that answers the question, learners, how does it that some rivers never dry? How come it rains all the time without exhausting? We receive rain all the time without exhausting the source. So that explains how water moves, learners, how water moves from the air to the earth's surface and back to the air again. So the cycle continues day in, day out, month in, month out, year in, year out. That is the hydrological cycle. Learners, do you have any question? If you have any question, feel free to ask. Below this video, there is a comment section. You can post your questions. And that will mark the end of our today's lesson, where we explained the hydrological cycle. Hydrological cycle. So I'm going to give you a question. Just one question for your assignment, learners. Question, I'm calling it revision question. Revision question. Number one, explain, it's just one. Explain the hydrological cycle. Go through the video one more time. Go through the video twice. Put down notes. Then close your exercise book and see if you can explain the hydrological cycle. Learners, we will continue to learn more about hydrological cycle in our subsequent lessons. Thank you for tuning in. Continue tuning in for more information, for more knowledge in geography. Bye-bye.
Thank you for choosing to study with us. For more information, you can call us on 0724 173845.